Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to let a few more people settle in here before we get going at our launch. Welcome. I see people are shuffling in. David Wall, Aaron Morey, J.R. Carpenter. Lots of people here shuffling in. Chris Turnbull just entered, Hugh Thomas, lots of people coming into the Zoom. We're just gonna wait a couple more minutes before we begin here. Welcome. As I hold up the book in question. Welcome, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Librairie Drawn Quarterly presents Jordan Abel launching NISHGA. My name is Luke Langell, and I work here at Librairie Drawn Quarterly. I'm honored to introduce Jordan Abel as we launch his powerful new memoir with special guest Ian Williams. I want to start off by mentioning that this event is taking place virtually across many different territories. I'm located on the unceded territory of the NISHGA, which has been a gathering place for many nations. While many of us refer to Montreal as our home, it is named Tiohtià:ke. We are grateful that creating and sharing stories has been a part of this land for thousands of years, and we urge you to seek out a story that is different from your own. NISHGA is a powerful and poignant memoir about intergenerational trauma, residential schools, colonial violence, memory, and documentation. Poems, photos, legal briefs, interactions, Google searches, graphs, audio, anecdotes, notes, and stories abound in this groundbreaking, genre-defying memoir. As Alicia Elliott puts it, NISHGA is an unforgettable portrait of an Indigenous artist trying to find his place in a world that insists indigeneity can only ever be the things that he is not. Tonight we'll start with a presentation by Jordan Abel, followed by a short conversation between Abel and Williams, followed by a Q&A. You'll be able to write your questions using the chat. Excuse me, not using the chat. Please do not use the chat. Using the Q&A function in the bottom, that's best for questions. And Librairie Drawn Quarterly ships Canada-wide now, and we have many copies of NISHGA on hand available for purchase, and we thank you for supporting independent bookstores. Ian Williams is the author of the Giller Prize-winning novel Reproduction. His novels have been shortlisted for the Griffin Poetry Prize, among others. Williams holds a PhD in English at the University of Toronto, where he is currently a professor of English at the University of Toronto. Jordan Abel is a NISHGA writer from Vancouver. He's the author of The Place of Scraps, Uninhabited, and Injun, which won the 2017 Griffin Poetry Prize. Abel's work has been published in numerous journals and magazines, including Canadian Literature, the Capilano Review, and Poetry is Dead. And his visual poetry has been featured in exhibitions at numerous galleries, including at the Oslo Pilot Project Room in Norway. Abel recently completed a PhD at Simon Fraser University, and he is currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of English and Film Studies at the University of Alberta, where he teaches Indigenous literatures and creative writing. Lastly, this event happens in the context of the painful news from Kamloops. We support calls for concrete action to address the trauma and violence of residential schools, including those made in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. The local nonprofits we'd like to uplift are Resilience Montreal and the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal. And we'll also share a link to the Indian Residential School Survivors Society in the chat. Without further ado, please join me from your homes in welcoming Jordan and Ian to the launch.
Thank you, Luke. Thanks for that. Hi, Jordan. Hi, everyone. That's a really sobering last note there that Luke made. And so I'm joining you from Toronto, and I'd like to acknowledge these things can feel a little bit rote sometimes, but more and more, I think we recognize just how important it is to acknowledge that I'm a guest on the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and many other Inuit and Métis people who are in this region. Because of the values of settlers, we get news like we did last week about children literally dying so that a certain set of values could go forward. And Jordan's book takes this on really, really brilliantly. Jordan, I don't know how to talk about your book without causing you pain. And so I'm hoping that we can find a way to do it tonight.
We'll just talk about the happy parts.
We'll find a way. We'll find a way through it. So about a year and a half ago, our publicist was telling me about this book. It was not done yet, as far as I know, and he was really excited about it. And then, page 250 of your book. I should also say, for those of you in the audience, that this dissertation as a whole is now a book called NISHGA that will be coming out in 2020 with McClelland and Stewart. It was supposed to come out in 2020, Jordan. What happened? What were you trying to get right for the last couple of years?
Oh my gosh. It's 2021. This book is a year late. It says it right there on page 250.
Yeah, was it something technical? Was there something emotional? What were you working on that sort of stretched it a little bit?
Oh, I was working on nothing at all. The book was unfortunately delayed due to the pandemic, of course. And I think at the time that it was about to come out was the time that I think pretty much everything went into lockdown here in Canada, and I think we made the decision at that moment to delay it, and then it got I can't remember if we even decided on a date at that moment, but we were going to pause, and that pause took a year, and so the book has existed in the world for that year. I think it's just been like in various warehouses, somewhere hiding,
right.
Nobody reading it.
Well,
but it was there.
So, like emotionally, what happens in that year? Were you dreading the fact like, oh, I'm going to have to talk about this in a year? I should be talking about it now? Or is it like anticipation, or is it a bit of relief that, hey, I can catch my breath, I can figure how I want this to go down?
Totally. Well, it was a really intense year for me, actually. Like at first, I think I was definitely a little disappointed that I couldn't share the book with people, and I obviously want to do so. But my daughter was born in July last year, which was just a couple of months after this all happened, and she really it took all of my attention away. And I think that really helps alleviate any concerns I had over that year. And now it's just like a surprise that like, oh, this book is still here, and I still want to talk about it.
Right. Yeah, I know people say it's a little flippant to compare like a book to a kid and all of that, right? I know I know they're different things. But there's something analogous all the same about it. Jordan, so there are a few ways into this book, right? It feels like there are a couple of entrances. And one of the first pages is a quotation from John A. MacDonald. And to read a bit of it, Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. You flip a page over, and then we have three other really like damaging quotations from Duncan Scott, best known as the poet, right? One of the Confederation poets, but also a civil servant in the Indian Affairs Department. I'll read a couple of sentences from this. Our objective is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada, that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there's no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole objective of this bill. Next quotation down, he talks about gearing towards a final solution of our Indian problem, right? The echo there is pretty evident. Now, why put this material right up front? Why this entrance into the book?
Yeah, I think this is a book about intergenerational trauma and the legacy of violence that ripples outwards, outwards from residential schools, and for me in particular from the Coquilita Indian Residential School. And I think I think the I think that particular school has shaped my life really profoundly. And I think those quotes from Duncan Campbell Scott's and John A. MacDonald's have also similarly shaped my life. I think those those are I think those are important moments, where certainly they weren't the only people to have those views, but I think I like they they speak with such callousness, in those quotes. And I think the more I read the more I return to those moments, the more difficult they become. And I think this book is also a very personal one for me, and it's very much about my mom and my dad's and my grandparents. And in earlier drafts of the book, it was very laser focused, on me and my family. And I really kind of felt at some point, I think at some later stage, like that somebody might come to this book with no knowledge at all about residential schools in Canada and their legacy. And I felt like including those quotes was a necessary moment for me to widen that scope a little bit and to attempt to provide people with some context, if they were unfamiliar with those people and their legacies. And I think that quote, those two quotes are also actually followed up by, I think, a really powerful quote by Gregory Schofield that he posted on Facebook that I think also shapes the book. I guess this is also a moment where there probably could have been a dozen epigraphs to start off the book, and I tried to include all of them. Or also, several of them.
There's also this personal entrance too, and I know you're going to read from this, and it's like coming in via the sort of main gate or coming in through this really sort of lovely like back door, right? And that personal like domestic entrance right into your kitchen is the one that is trying to survive through the whole book in the face of this really sort of like horrid and nauseating kind of language. So would you mind sharing a bit with us?
Totally. Yeah. I will read I will read that opening note. So on page 1 of the book, there's a piece called An Open Letter to All My Relations, which is also the same title for the piece that closes out the book. But this is so I guess it's like a two-part piece. But this piece starts in this way. It's taken me a long while to gather up the courage to share this book with you. This book has been difficult for me to write and for me to return to. This is also a book with painful subject matter. This is a book about intergenerational trauma, Indigenous dispossession, and the afterlife of residential schools. It is also a book that is about sexual and physical violence, lateral violence, depression, suicide, and self-harm. While I ultimately hope this will be a book that helps people, I also want you to take care of yourself first. If now is not the time, there will be another time. And I'll follow this up with one more short reading, and then we can circle back to the questions. This is the other piece that I've been finding it really useful to start from for this book is a piece that starts on page 35, and it's from the TransCanada's, it's an excerpt from a presentation I gave at the TransCanada's conference in 2017. Hi everyone, my name is Jordan Abel. I am a NISHGA writer from Vancouver, BC. I identify this way because for many Indigenous peoples, these kinds of national identifications can indicate one's home, one's friends and family, and one's position within indigeneity. Likewise, these kinds of national identifications can often also be an indicator of which community or communities we are accountable to. For example, Layli Longsoldier identifies as a citizen of the Oglala Lakota Nation. Louise Erdrich identifies as being of both Chippewa and German American descent. And Scott Mamade identifies as being Kiowa. Leslie Marmon Silko identifies as having Laguna Pueblo, Mexican, and Anglo-American heritage. Marie Ann Hart Baker identifies as being Anishinaabe from the Little Saskatchewan First Nation in Manitoba. That being said, these kinds of national identifications do not always adequately account for the complexity and plurality of Indigenous identity. For some Indigenous peoples, they simply do not tell the whole story. For example, when I say that I'm NISHGA, you might assume that I grew up in Kincolith, BC, like my grandparents. You might assume when I say that I'm NISHGA that I speak NISHGA. You might assume that my writing reflects on NISHGA knowledge, NISHGA worldviews, and NISHGA understandings. Then again, you might not assume any of those things. A few years ago, during the City of Vancouver's Year of Reconciliation events, I was at a dinner meeting at a restaurant on Water Street. I was one of a few poets that was commissioned to write a poem in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The initiative was called Reconciliation Through Poetry. The work that the poets were engaging with was meant to honor the work of Chief Robert Joseph. At the dinner meeting, the poets, along with a few administrators, talked with Chief Robert Joseph, exchanged stories, and discussed what reconciliation meant for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. After a while, Chief Joseph directed his attention to me and asked me where I was from. I told him that I was NISHGA and that my grandparents were from Kincolith. After a few moments, he said, "You're not really NISHGA. Some of my friends are NISHGA. Do you know how I can tell? If you were really NISHGA, you would have said NISHGA with a K sound. NISHGA. You said NISHGA with an SH sound." You know, I didn't really know how to respond to that. My grandparents are NISHGA, my dad is NISHGA, but to a certain extent he was right. I wasn't born in Kincolith, I was born in Vancouver, moved when I was very young, and essentially grew up in Ontario. Does that make me less NISHGA? And what does it mean anyway to be NISHGA with a K sound? What does it mean to be NISHGA with an SH sound? What does it mean to be NISHGA but to have grown up removed from the NISHGA community? What does it mean to be Indigenous if your relationship to community has become severed somehow? What does it mean to be both an intergenerational survivor of residential schools and an urban Indigenous person? I think these are the questions that I've been struggling with my whole life. And I will pause there.
Thank you for that, Jordan. Right. I mean, there is sort of the heart of the book, right? And at the end, you also talk about maybe there's going to be a young kid or something who's in the same situation, who doesn't feel indigenous enough or can't quite trace or doesn't have a connection to the land. I'm curious about this fellow who corrects your pronunciation. Elsewhere in the book, you say that every time we give a reading, we're called on to like educate the audience. Um, that the performance space is also an educational space, right? And so racialized writers, do you think racialized writers become de facto educators every time we go out into this public space? What you're doing right now, do you have some obligation now to educate people about the correct pronunciation of this word or the history or Johnny McDonald and so forth?
Yeah, I feel like that is absolutely a question that I have struggled with, the whole time that I've been a writer, and I'm curious how you feel about this too,
Mm.
but I think to some extent, there's no avoiding it, like I think it's so hard sometimes to have conversations, you know, like it's so hard to have a conversation about NISHGA if people don't know what happened at residential schools, like I think, and part of that is, in the book. But when you're doing a reading, when you're out in public, I think the the folks you're talking to, haven't necessarily read that book yet, or may have read other different books or not read anything at all. And I think it's so hard um, to have good, meaningful conversations with people if you don't have any common ground to stand on.
Mhm.
And at the same time, I think like that's that work and that impulse to try to educate or to fill in the gaps, is so incredibly difficult, and not something that you know we can ever really hope to accomplish. I think, it's in so many instances, and I think, is something that I think is potentially really unfairly, put on us, as a thing that we are it seems like we're responsible for in certain moments,
Mhm.
um when perhaps we would rather spend our time you know doing anything else.
Right. Right. Yeah, it feels like there's this extra criterion applied to racialized people where our books have to do all these other things and then also have this kind of educational component or this, am I going to learn something new about what it is to be Black or what it is to be Indigenous? Um,
Totally.
yeah, that's sort of added on. And the book gets measured in that kind of way too, right? So is this the same story? Is this a familiar story? Um, yeah, and that work of disabusing public of their expectations of what indigeneity is or what Blackness is. Um, and you could have done it, you could have gone an easy route here, Jordan, and claimed expertise, you're well read, you're educated, you could have gone that way. But in fact, you say, I've got a troubled relationship to indigeneity. Lots of people do. Um, and I think that honesty is really refreshing, right? When people look to us for a source of certainty about race or indigenous relations.
Yeah, I think it makes so much sense to try to be as open and as honest, as we can be about, our relationships in relation to indigeneity or to Blackness, and to really, you know like think carefully about what we know and what we don't know.
We don't
and
know.
I, and I think there are yeah, I think, admitting, like for me, just personally, I think like admitting what I don't know has been, a really incredible gift in finding ways to learn more.
Mm,
Like, and I don't know so many things.
mm,
Um, I think even very personal things, like, this, like this book, has so many, like, it's a personal narrative, but there's so many gaps, there's so
mm,
many questions left unanswered, there's so many, elements of the narrative that are never filled in. And the reason is that, or the reason in many cases is that I simply, don't have the answers, and
right.
have no information to fill in there.
Mm,
But I think, um,
mm,
I think that's, I think that not knowing, is an important thing to do sometimes, or
mhm,
admitting to not knowing.
mhm, mhm. Let's talk about one of those gaps, Jordan. So one of those gaps is your father, who is um, your absent father really haunts the book, right? But that it's a really charged absence there. Um, he's an artist. You meet through art. You connect through art, if not in person. Um, and this is it's a bit of a weird question, right? But is having no father better than having a bad father, or having a bad father better than having no father? And I mean, like when people let's take one side of that, they're often like uh, as if absence is neutral, right? So I'm wondering, is the absence of your father, like no father, neutral? Is that preferable to having a bad father in your life?
Yeah, that's so funny. That's totally a question that, I've asked myself, especially, especially, when I've had moments, with friends, or other family members, who have had, not so great fathers, in their lives. And, you know, I I will probably continue to ask myself that question. Um, but I think in this project, like, it was like the thing that comes up in the book, is that it's not only, my father who's missing from my life, but it's also, he, in a certain way, he like represents, like NISHGA culture being missing in my life, and the NISHGA language being missing in my life. And I think, there's a doubleness there that I think I really, it took me a long time to figure out that those were overlapping things. And, it wasn't just that, my dad wasn't there. It was also that, I had, become severed, from my language and from my community, and that, to find a way back, the path wasn't necessarily, um, to find my father again, which and which part of the narrative talks about this, but I met that I've met that guy once in my life, and it was like this really like intense moment. Um, and I think when that happens for me, I realized that, I that I had all of these expectations for that moment, and that, that moment could never possibly live up to those expectations, because, what I wanted, was a pathway back home.
Yeah.
And, that moment didn't get me there.
Mhm. Yeah, elsewhere in the book, you talk about it as incompleteness, right? And if a friend has advice for you about carrying around incompleteness, um, but what are we supposed to do with incompleteness, right? Whether it's this sense of not being complete in one's culture, complete in one's family, are we supposed to fill it with expectations? Are we supposed to just coexist with the nothingness that's there? Are we supposed to inflate ourselves to fill in that space? Like what works? This has become therapy now, suddenly. We'll move on. Okay. We'll move on after this, I promise.
Yeah, no, I think, I think the answer, uh, the answer to that for me is that, I don't totally know what works, but, my strategies, I think, were initially to, you know, try to fill that hole, in some way, and to try to, it, try to, fill in these pieces of myself that, I'd felt were insufficient, or that, others had suggested, were insufficient in some way. And I think, the strategy that, I've come to now is to move, more towards whatever self-acceptance looks like, and to try to um, to to I guess understands, that there are certain things that can never be fixed completely. And when I think about, or when I think about my relationship to Indigenous language, for example, like I'm still learning NISHGA. I'm still at the very early stages of it, and part of the thing that has become a barrier, is that it's difficult sometimes to connect with language speakers who are willing to teach me, in part because I no longer I've never lived on NISHGA territory. I'm now in Edmonton and Treaty 6 territory, which is nowhere near NISHGA territory. So I think there's all these roadblocks that are in place, and that journey for me is a lifelong journey. That it's not something that I can just cross off the list in a year or two, but something that I'll probably spend a lot of time in the coming years trying to figure out and trying to engage with. I don't know if that's the right way to deal with it.
I think you brought up.
Go
please
ahead.
finish. Sure.
All I was going to say was I think that's just the way I've been attempting to figure it out.
Yeah, and you bring up something really interesting in your comment there, which is that for you to say complete your language learning, it's going to take a long time, right? And it's hard to find. There are a number of roadblocks, is how you put it, that prevent you. But let's say a white settler wanted to connect with her roots and she discovers that she's Italian. It's far easier for her to go and find, learn some Italian on Duolingo, or, find some Italian speakers and stuff. So when you talk about when we talk about systemic barriers to accessing one's history, I can't cross the Atlantic. I just I just simply don't know what happened in Africa in my life. So there are these kinds of barriers that just prevent us from ever reaching the state of completion. If completion means a knowledge of one's past, right?
Totally. And I think those barriers, don't get talked about enough. Like the Duolingo is actually a really amazing example. I can learn Klingon easier than I can learn NISHGA, and that I think that says something, and I don't know what to do with that knowledge, and it's frustrating in some ways, because there's all of these resources, put into all of these amazing learning apps, and they choose Klingon over however many 600 languages that exist for First Nations peoples in Canada.
Right. Exactly. It's a beautiful book, Jordan. Here, if you've got audience questions from the audience, please put it in the Q&A box there, and we'll get to them pretty soon. It's a beautiful book. McClellan Stewart did a great job with the design of it. Your books are never easy to lay out, right? You should just come with your own layout artist. It's part notes, there are web pages in here, there are images, there's a slideshow that runs around page 50. And you've got this way of directly engaging with your sources by quoting them. It reminds me a little bit of Claudia Rankine's Just Us, in the way that you both, for instance, you think about the page as a spread, right? Rather than as, a recto and a verso. So we've got almost like this magazine feeling, right? This expansive kind of prairie-like feeling when we look at pages. So really beautiful. But in terms of the multimedia effect in the book, why is it that that multimedia or this kind of hybrid text is the best way to talk about one's history or your history particularly? Is this how your brain works?
Totally, yeah. I think so. I can answer this in two ways. The first way is that this is totally just how my artistic brain functions most of the time. And NISHGA is a memoir and autobiography, but I tend to think about it as a multi-genre work. It includes creative nonfiction, obviously, but it also includes transcription of academic talks. It includes photography. It includes concrete poetry. It's a work that's at the intersection between all of those genres. And if you look at my other work, going all the way back to my first book, which is a book called The Place of Scraps, that book is published as poetry, but it is also creative nonfiction and historical fiction and erasure poetry and photography all put together in some way. And then my second and third books, Uninhabited and Engine, are both at the intersection between fiction and poetry. So I think whatever artistic trajectory I'm on, it's one that includes multi-genre approaches to everything I do. But the second way I was going to answer it, which is a more personal way, which is to say that for NISHGA, there were some things that were very difficult for me to articulate. And in particular, I'm thinking about a few of the sections that are mostly images, and in those moments, when I was writing the book, I really struggled with finding ways to put words to the feelings that I had, which is a weird position to be in as a writer. And instead, I think I had to turn to other genres to figure out how to do that. And for me, that ended up being photography. And I think that lended itself really well to the visual trajectory of the book, where because well, I guess we haven't really talked about this yet, but there's a lot of my dad's artwork in this book, and one of the ways that I attempt to get to know my dad, as I talk about in the later half of the book, is through his artwork, and I put his artwork in conversation with my artistic output, which is mostly textual, and I think in that way there's this intertwining between my dad's arts and my arts that flows throughout the book, and there's always this kind of tension between them, and also this tension between the visual and the textual, and I think those particular moments, like I can't imagine any other way to do them. Like I couldn't imagine trying to talk about my dad's artistic work in relation to my own work, without doing it visually. And perhaps that's my failing as a writer, or
Did you say
my
you're feeling or you're did you say you're feeling or you're failing?
Perhaps that's my failing as a writer, but my success as like a, I don't know, visual artist, in certain moments.
Those sections that you talk about in the book, they're in fact devastating, right? Where the words cut out, like words fail. And then we've got, 20 something pages of just images and blurriness and yeah, there are no words at that point. And yeah, to use the silences, craft craft lessons will say, you got to use your silences and stuff too. But apart from saying she was silent for a while, you in fact embodied this, right? You did it, right? You did it. And that silence actually visually, it floods her eyes. Really well done. The effect of it, you have to see on paper in the reading experience, right? And I love books too that really celebrate textuality. It's something I try to do all the time to like really energize the print form and to make people love spending time alone with a book. So really, this is a joy, right? To see books that behave this way.
Yeah, thanks so much. I feel actually very similarly. Like I obviously love books, and love books that you can really dig into and find interesting stuff in. So I'm so glad that part of it worked, and that McClellan and Stewart was willing to take a chance on this one.
Right. Right. We've got a few questions from the audience here. I'm going to pause my questions here and turn to let's see, Ellie. Hi, Jordan. Hi, Ian. Jordan, what in your previous books allowed you to arrive here in this book? Are you seeing a direct line of development influence tactic from those poetic and conceptual explorations in this memoir? I know this audience member, she reads lots of poetry, so thanks
Hey,
for the
Ellie,
question.
thank you so much for your question. I think you know I would describe this book, the origins of this book come out of all of these artist talks that I've given over the last couple of years, where I literally talk about my other books. I think in some ways, like I see the book, as a NISHGA as a whole, as being an extended artist talk, where I talk about how how my first book, for example, The Place of Scraps, is still a book that lingers with me, and and some of the questions that come up for people when they read that book, for example, are about why Marius Barbeau, why choose to erase Marius Barbeau, which I always which I, for some reason, I feel compelled to answer, and I think that's I think that answer it's partly in the book, or I hope it's here. But that's like there's absolutely I think an interest in trying to see all of my works together in a trajectory in this work.
Yeah, it's this continuous project, right? The life project. Yeah, when you're 60, you'll look back, Jordan, and you'll see the connections, I guess, more clearly and stuff. But it's wonderful, though, to see, to feel one's career kind of emerging, right? And your preoccupations kind of deepening or shifting or focusing themselves. Really exciting to be like, our age right now and creating.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. I think there'll be moments later on in my life where I'll be able to see more of those patterns, but even just like reflecting on some of my previous books, like there's always these moments where I move from legibility to illegibility. Like there's always that shift somehow, and then sometimes it moves from legibility to illegibility back to legibility again. But I think it's funny what happens when you line up all of your writing and look at it and see the kinds of moves that you make over and over again.
All right, let's take another question here. This is from Lisa Martin. Hi, Lisa. Thank you both for this generous conversation. Listening in has been a gift. Jordan, hopefully without setting this question up as too leading a question, I'm wondering if you can say anything about the different possibilities of creative work and academic work for you. Do you see this work as both creative and academic, or can you say anything about how you thought about this kind of work you're doing here as you were doing it? And you've started to answer that question already.
Totally. Yeah, I think this is a really important question for me too. And I think we mentioned this earlier. This book was originally my PhD dissertation, and it kind of shifted and changed a little bit after that. But the the bulk of it, was put forward as my dissertation at SFU, and so I think there was. Uh, I think at that moment, people were looking at it as a work that was both academic and creative, at different moments, at different times, and I think that's and I think the more I think about it and the more I've reflected on it, the more I would say, I think this work takes certain cues from work that is academic work, and there's questions that come up in academic work that I think I, try to respond to or try to engage with, but the output, for this book, I think is mostly creative. Like there's few moments, where I transcribe those academic talks in the books. Like I think there's maybe 3 or 4 moments where I have given a public talk and then provide the more or less the full transcript. But even those talks are kind of creative academic talks. Like they're not traditional academic papers. And so I wonder, I guess, I think I'm still reflecting on, what this work is, and where it fits within both academic and creative spheres.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, it's perhaps some of both. And I think like that to me is really exciting. That it's I I'm not super excited about academic writing sometimes. I think it's kind of tough to get through, and I'm very happy that this book will find hopefully a wider audience than some academic books do.
Right. And we're seeing you breaking down that boundary, right? Between, we see folks like Ann Carson do it and Claudia Rankin, people breaking down this boundary between what is scholarly and what is creative. And a book like your book right now, it's intelligent, it's smart, it's got big ideas, and it references other voices in there, but it's not done in the usual kind of prescribed academic way. And I think it's that form, that form of proper discourse in academia, that can really be a turnoff. And you've managed to keep the rigor of it without, without the dullness of it.
I hope so. I think that was the goal at one point. Is to try and do exactly what you just said.
We've got another question here from Matthew Tierney, editor extraordinaire. Hi, Jordan. Can you talk about the reasons behind mixing genres within the memoir? You didn't just write straight prose fiction. Was this decided from the beginning of the book, or did it evolve? What are the effects you're hoping to achieve? Oh, I'd be curious to know what your draft 4 was like in this whole process.
Totally. Well, thank you, Matthew, for the question. I think I answered this a little bit, but I can fill in some more details, which is to say that, that process did totally evolve. So like the draft 1 for this book was just me transcribing all of these archival pieces that my mom gave me. So I talk about it in this book, but at some point my mom gave me this box in which she had all of these notes and all these documents and all these photographs. And my first active writing moment for this book was to transcribe all that stuff and see if there was anything that was useful. So the first book didn't really contain any of my voice, which immediately became a problem because I had a lot of stuff to say about these things. And so the second draft, I started to I added in I think I added in some of the academic talks that I had done. And then I think like slowly and slowly I just kept adding more and more pieces to try and fit everything together, and that really necessitated me trying out or trying to add in different genres that address different things. Like you mentioned Claudia Rankin earlier. I've been so inspired by Citizen since it came out, and I think that's such an incredibly powerful book. And one of the things that I thought was so incredible about that book, was just the way that Rankin, it describes these experiences that she has with other people, or sometimes they're not experiences that she's had directly, but they've been relayed to her by others. But these really kind of devastating, puncturing moments, that she describes, and I felt like there was moments that I really wanted to find a way to talk about in my life, and like that moment that I talked about with Chief Robert Joseph, was one of those moments, where I felt something real happens there, and I was unable to figure out how to respond to it at that time that it happened. But I reflected on it and I thought about it, and I think that was a really kind of pivotal moment for this book and for me in my life. And so the that multi-genre approach to the memoir, I think really kind of came about because I was trying to fill in all of these gaps, and trying to add in all of these pieces that completed this picture of what intergenerational trauma might look like, or did look like for me. Although I think I say elsewhere that it might look differently for other people, which I think is true.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the Matthew asks here, what are the effects you're hoping to achieve? Yeah, like what is the feeling? You're really good, Jordan, at building a mood, right? And kind of sustaining it through an entire project. And even when you do readings and you've got, the mixer and stuff going on,
Right.
you can really build. You still do this, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
You sounded like this was a thing of the past or something. Okay. But yeah, this kind of mood building, the way that some sci-fi writers do the world building. Yeah. So at what point does the mood building happen for you in the drafting process? Are you shuffling things around? Is it right there from the beginning, or?
Yeah. No, I think the way I'd answer this question is to say that, the effects that I am trying to achieve, I think, is actually that feeling that you have that you want to turn the page over and see what's on the next page, and to invite readers to fall into that rhythm, which I think is intertwined with mood. That like there's I don't like they're in yeah they overlap, or they're in parallel in some places, but I think I really like I really wanted people to not get stuck ever, and to always, find like feel like they could move forward. And that, was a really I think that was like a really intense feeling for me. And I was writing this, that I really wanted that momentum to flow throughout the book, um, which I realize wasn't maybe exactly the thing you're asking, Matthew.
No.
But I guess that's how I've been thinking of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Momentum, right? Momentum. Here's a question from Jane McDonald. Thank you, Jordan and Ian. Jordan, do you think about how or who your work is received by, or some site or listener or witness where your work lands? Does the sense of being received play into your creating? Thank you so much.
Totally. I think this actually just dovetails into the last thing I was talking about, which is that I'm for this book, and for all the books I've written, I am thinking really intensely about the person who encounters the book and how they encounter it and how they move across the page, or through pages, or beyond page 5 or whatever it is. And I think likewise, I also the first book, or the first page in the book, which I read to you earlier, which is called An Open Letter to All My Relations. I think that's partly an introduction to the book, and also partly a gesture towards who I imagine the book is for. I mean all my relations, in both in both a sense of family, but also an inclusive sense of other indigenous peoples, and other peoples who have become dispossessed from their home territories, and other people who find some form of overlap with the things that I'm trying to talk about. And I think that's I have this feeling that we have a lot of shared connections between all of us that sometimes we don't get to talk about, or that we never really get to address. And I think this book is kind of about that.
Yeah, I had a shared moment with you towards the end of the book, and we're almost at time here, so maybe we can end on this idea here. It's on page 271, and you say, when I started writing this book, I did it just for me. I did it so that I could hold all pieces up and see how they connected together. Right. So last fall, Jordan, I was in a similar situation where I was working on a novel, and then I stopped working on the novel because I just needed to write everything that I believed about race and Blackness, right? I just needed to get it all down and out of me. So I recognized this. That's happening there. My thinking, though, at that point was like, if I could just get it all out of me, it will be outside, and it will be like contained, and I will understand it, and I will be done with it. It was a gesture of completion. But I'm curious, do you think that you completed something here? Or do you think that this now will continue in 5 years, and in 7 years, and in 10 years, and there'll be another? What is it, a completion, or is it an opening up, a beginning?
I think it's probably both. That experience that you just described, really resonates with me. Like, that feeling of, if you can just get it down, on paper, that it will be contained in some way, that it's no longer like, it's outside of you, and now somehow, you can maybe begin to understand it differently, at that moment. And I really felt that way about this book too. And I think I think in a lot of ways, this was an extremely difficult book for me to write, but I think there are hopeful notes in it. And in particular, I'm thinking about those moments where my arts, as that comes up, as text, intertwines, with my father's arts. And I think, if there's a continuing on, I think it will be in that vein. But I think certainly, like, this so much of this subject matter will never leave me.
Right. Well, thank you, Jordan. I think we are almost out of time here. Luke's going to come back.
Yeah, beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much again, Ian and Jordan. What a wonderful conversation. Yeah, really lovely. Go buy the book. It's excellent. I highly recommend it. And thanks again, everyone. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Ian, so much for all of your amazing questions, and thank you, Luke, and thank you everyone for being here. I realize there's probably so many other things you could do tonight, and it is super cool to see all of you here. So thank you. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks all. Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you.